Either way, he needs to come back during a legislative session and educate our legislators. That would change a lot of things. Isn't that right? Once again, would you please welcome Bill Federer. Water's there for you.
All right. Thank you, Pastor Scott. And I am such a fan of Pastor Scott Craig, and he is a hero to me. He's somebody that loves the Lord and loves America and knows how to put it all together. And thank you for being such a champion. Amen. Well, I'd like to come up often, but my wife likes Florida. I have a couple books that I'm not going to talk about, but I'll let you. This one's called Who is the King in America? It's an overview of 6,000 years of recorded human history from the beginning of the invention of writing, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. And the most common form of government is what? Kings, right? And it's basically gangs. The default setting for human government is gangs, and a gang leader with enough weapons we call a king. And so you have Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsars. As centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with military advancements, they could kill. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, iron weapon, phalanx, spear, scimitar, sword, composite bow, gunpowder. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technological advancements, kings can track more people. 2 BC, Augustus Caesar wanted a worldwide tracking system. It's called the census, the tax enrollment. If he could have had 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, he'd have been tempted to use that. They keep creating until finally the King of England had the biggest empire on the planet. He was a globalist. The sun never set on the British Empire. India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, and America. And America's founders didn't like a globalist king telling us what to do. They broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. So the word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. Pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. A republic is where the people are king, ruling through the representative. So we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. And so when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, okay, somebody else will be happy to rule you. So in America, the people are the king. And I go through where they got their ideas. From the New England pastors. They got their idea from the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. So it's called the Hebrew Republic. So around 1400 BC, you have millions of Israelites come out of Egypt. And for 400 years, there's no king. It's a system that works because everybody's taught the law and everybody's personally accountable to God to follow the law. You're about to steal, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. Create something in your head called the conscience. And it worked until the priest stopped teaching the law. You said, the priest stopped teaching the law? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. Another Levite with a graven image. Another Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. And they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say the self-government system's not working. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they did not reject you, they rejected me. Now, why is this important? Because the kings of England looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on part, this anointed king, divine right of kings. The Calvinist Puritans that founded America looked to the pre-King Saul part. 400 years, millions of people, no king, everybody sought the law and accountable to God to follow it. So King Saul is the divider between America and England. And so when people say, well, you want to have Christian theocracy, you want white supremacy, you want dominionism, it's like, no, you're talking Europe, you're talking England. The kings of England said, you have to believe exactly what I tell you to believe or I'm going to burn you at the stake. And these founders were like, no, William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, said, force makes hypocrites, 'tis persuasion only that makes converts. And so these people flood to America, and what do they put into our documents? Freedom of conscience. Government from the consent of the governed, right? We have a bottom-up form of government where the rest of the world was top-down form of government. So that's what this book's about. And then this book is on socialism. It's like, how do you get people to give up their freedom? 2 ways, fear and free stuff. If you get people into fear, they'll panic and trade their freedom for security. And the other is you give them free stuff till they get dependent. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He comes in with guns, gets them into fear, they submit to the mob, or the drug dealer's so nice he's giving you free drugs until you get hooked. And then you want more free drugs, you're going to have to incrementally give up your freedom. And so socialism is a back door into people surrendering their freedoms to the state. And but that's not what I was going to talk about tonight. So I put together a book, and let's see here. And I was wanting to explain what's going on in the Middle East from a point of view that you may not have heard of. Anyway, and so we have these terrorist attacks, and we have to go back and look at Mohammed. And he's the best Muslim that ever lived. And so his life is the sunnah, which means the way or the example. His life went through three stages. He was a religious leader, then he became a political leader, then he became a military leader. And so this is the world before Muhammad was born. You have the Byzantine Christian Empire, and it's fighting Persia. It's 1,000 years competition between Rome and Persia. And they beat each other up and leave a power vacuum. And so Muhammad, his father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6. His grandfather, guardian, dies when he's 8. He's taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who's a merchant. He goes on camel rides, and he goes to different cities, hears about the different religions. And anyway, long and short, he begins his faith, and he's in Mecca, and he makes 70 converts in 12 years. And they chase him out of town. And so he goes to Medina, which was a Jewish city, and they let him in, and he goes to the minority neighborhoods, organizes a following, and he becomes a political leader. And then when his followers get chased out of Mecca, that's when they begin to rob the caravans headed back to Mecca, and he becomes a military leader, and he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. Battle of Badra, Battle of Uhud, and all these different battles. And anyway, so it's in 3 steps: it's religious, political, military. And let's see here. So I'm skipping past the stuff because I want to get to the more recent Ottoman Empire history. 2 sets of verses in the Quran. Meccan verses are more religious, and the Medina verses are more political and militant. And the later verses supersede or abrogate the earlier verses. And then within 5 years of him coming into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within the next 50 years after his death, they conquer all of North Africa. And the expansion is broken into 3 periods of time. First, there's an Arab-Persian expansion, 622 to 1071. Next is a Turkish expansion from 1071 to 1923. And then the last one started in 1928 with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the goal is to have a one-world government. And the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. And a Muslim is one who has submitted. And I actually went to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and they have a whole room full of swords, and they have what they claim is Muhammad's sword. And so within just 23 years after Muhammad's death, the rightly guided caliphs conquer Arabia. You have Caliph Abu Bakr, and then Caliph Uthman, and Caliph Ali, and Caliph Umar, and so forth. And they conquer Syria, which had been Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. Syria was completely Christian. And there's more ancient writing in the Christian language in Syriac than any other writing other than Greek and Latin. And the Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greeks did west. So the Syrian Christians went into India and even China. And then in Egypt, you had Coptic Christians. The word Coptic is the Egyptian word for Egyptian. And the Coptic Christians were being persecuted by the Byzantine Christians over some little theological thing that I can't even explain. And so when Amir ibn Alas comes to the borders of Egypt, the Coptic Christians invite him in to help drive out the Byzantine Christians, but then they end up taking over. And then the Umayyad Muslims conquer all of North Africa. There were 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa, but the Christians had taught themselves to withdraw. It was a movement that swept through Christianity called pietism, that if you really become a Christian, you should give away all your money and live in a cave or join a monastery. And so it was a withdrawal. It was their version of separation of church and state. Right? It's like, okay, if you're really Christian, you're not going to be involved and you're just going to focus on your own relationship with God and you're just going to let the world go down the drain. And so the Umayyad Muslims conquered North Africa, and then in the year 711, they crossed over and conquered Spain. There was a leader named Tariq, and the Arabic word for mountain is Jabal, and so he crosses and he lands in this mountain. So they call it Jabal Tariq, and we now pronounce it Gibraltar. Rock of Gibraltar, right? It was Jabal Tariq. That was where Tariq landed with 80,000 soldiers. Spain had all these different Visigothic Christian kingdoms, and they were always competing with each other, and therefore the division allowed him to conquer all of Spain in 10 years. And then they're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. Now, when this happens, it cuts off trade across the Mediterranean, and what was one of the things traded was papyrus. That was paper. And there was a sudden paper shortage in Europe, and so they wrote fewer books, and they call this the Dark Ages. So you go to a library and say, I want to pull out some books from the 600s and 700s and 800s, and like, oh, there's not too many books from that time period. So it's called the Dark Ages. And and then they're stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Mohammed in 632 AD. And then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean, attack Constantinople, but the Greeks have Greek fire, which is a mixture of oil and sawdust, sort of like napalm. They shoot it out of a hot oil cannon with a torch in front, sort of like holding a match in front of a can of hairspray. Anybody did that? Right? There's no kids in here. Don't try this at home. But it makes like a blowtorch, right? And so that's the Arab-Persian expansion. And Baghdad becomes the capital, and it begins to become a moderate for a period called the Islamic Golden Age. Now, some words. Word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted, and the fundamental teaching is that there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. And so to the fundamental ones, world peace means world Islam, world submission. You know, it's sort of a double meaning to a word. So we say peace, we mean one thing, and they say peace means... So Lincoln uses this quote. He says, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. Right? So when the North says liberty, it's freeing the slaves. When the South says liberty, it's kicking out the Northern Army. And so the world's divided in two, the half that has submitted and the half that's in the process of submitting. And a moderate Muslim is the one who thinks the world's going to submit later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's figurative, and the fundamental thinks it's supposed to submit now. And then another word that it has a different meaning is innocent. And so they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, but you're not innocent if you reject Allah. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidel, unbeliever, make war on the infidel, fight those who believe not in Allah, kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. And now, I skipped past the slides, but Muhammad never was able to read and write. The word Quran means recitation. It's an oral thing. And so they would memorize these verses, and they had a rhyme to them, similar to rap music today, right? And so you could memorize lots of text, but it has this rhyme or beat to it. And he never read the Old Testament, but he heard the Jewish oral traditions called the Talmud and Mishnah, and some of those stories get reflected in the Quran. Encyclopedia Britannica even says the gospel was made known to Muhammad through apocryphal and heretical sources. So at the time he lived, there were heresies over doctrinal differences. And so you had, usually there were different arguments over the divine nature of Christ. And so the apocryphal books were like the infancy gospel of Thomas, written a couple of centuries after Jesus' death. Nobody takes it serious because it says stuff in there that didn't happen and didn't describe Israel. But he heard those stories, and so some of the apocryphal stories of Thomas are in the Quran. Like one of them was Jesus made clay birds and clapped and they flew away. right, and things like that. And and then there's the Zoroastrian religion in Persia, and they believed paradise was filled full of virgins. It would fulfill all the guy's desires, and they believed in spirits or jinns or genies, and that got incorporated into his belief system. So you can sort of see all the beliefs that existed pre-Muhammad, and lo and behold, there's reflected in that faith. And so Muhammad's father-in-law, he had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. He had slave wives, concubines, and the youngest was Aisha. He marries around 9 years old. And Aisha's father is Abu Bakr, and he fought with Muhammad in every single battle, and so he knew the way. And so the word for way is Sunni or Sunnah, and so Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr, is the leader of the Sunni. And then Muhammad had a daughter named Fatima. She's married to Ali. And they have a son, Hussein, and he gets murdered by the Sunnis. And so it's the difference between the Sunni and the Shia. But Ali, it's the party of Ali, is called Shi'ali or Shiite. And so the Shiites are followers of the son-in-law Ali. The Sunnis are followers of the father-in-law Abu Bakr. And anyway... Now, you have two different groups in Islam. I mean, there's four different major interpretations of the teachings, but if you divide it into two, one is the moderate, and they're like the world will submit sometime in the future, and they're happy to live amongst other people. And then there's the ones that want to actually take over governments. And so here is one of the latter kind, Ajam Kadori, in London. He says, we've had enough of democracy and man-made law, call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system, demand full implementation of Sharia in Britain. And so what Sharia? It's trying to be like Muhammad. So he's the perfect Muslim. And Christians want to be like Jesus. Muslims want to be like Muhammad. But there's a difference. Christians do not believe they go to heaven by being like Jesus. They believe they go to heaven because they believe Jesus died on the cross to pay for all their sins. And they want to live like Jesus to show the world how much God loves everybody. Not so in Islam. They think their chances of going to paradise are directly proportional to how closely they can follow Muhammad's example. But even Muhammad said that even though I'm the prophet of Allah, I don't know what Allah will do with me. So there's no security there. What Muhammad permitted is permitted. It is called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. It is called haram. And so Islam, in that sense, is a long list of halals and harams, what's permitted, what's not permitted. And the fundamental ones don't even want you to ask why, because you could be considered doubting and then you're in trouble. So Muhammad liked cats. They are permitted. They're halal. Muhammad did not like dogs. They are not permitted. They're haram. So Sharia comes from four sources. One is the Quran. And this is the two cities Muhammad lived in, the Mecca and Medina verses. And then the Hadith, which are 60,000 stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. And then there's the Sirat, which is the biography of Muhammad written 100 years after his death. And then there's 1,400 years of rulings of imams interpreting the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirat. And there's the four major groups there. Muhammad owned slaves. He was a white Arab. There are hadiths that said he's the white man reclining on the couch. Another hadith said that when he lifted his arms to pray, they'd see the whiteness of his armpits. Another hadith, a guy on his donkey, and they're riding to prayer, and he said, I rubbed up and I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh. And Muhammad owned slaves, and he owned black slaves. And so they raided caravans, but then when they controlled the Mediterranean, they raided ships. And they would raid the coast of Spain, France, and Greece. And so there were whole Catholic orders through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would go under a white flag to North Africa to ransom back people. And then they enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans in 1,400 years. Khartoum was a slave trading city. Zanzibar, Tanzania, Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, the Niger River. And and then when Columbus discovers the New World, you have some of the Spaniards enslaving Native Americans. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest, finally gets the king and the Pope to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. But the greedy people say, where can we get more slaves? And someone said, Africa. And so that's when the Spanish and the Portuguese would go to the Muslim slave trading cities and buy Africans and bring them to the New World. And even David Livingstone was a Scottish missionary to the Congo in the 1800s, and he's going through the Congo and Rwanda, and he would witness to the natives. Come back a year later, ghost villages. Where's everybody? And it was the Arab slave traders that came through. And it still goes on today, unfortunately. Niger, Mauritania, Sudan. And now, after the expansion that I explained, that Arab-Persian expansion, they stopped and they just began to consolidate and rule over the area that they had gotten control of. And this is a period where they became more moderate. And you had leaders, scholars like Al-Farabi, 872-951. He tried to incorporate Greek science and philosophy, and he was brilliant. And he would write all these treaties and documents. And then you had Avicenna, 980 to 1037. He's a prominent Persian. He wrote 450 works on philosophy, medicine, math. These guys were brilliant. They were quoted for centuries by the Europeans. And then Averroes, he was a philosopher in Andalusia, Spain. He wrote on physics, music, geography, medicine, math. And if you were to take a snapshot of the world, you would have thought that the Muslim world was about to experience the Renaissance. What's the Renaissance? It's a rediscovery of all the Greek knowledge. And it's like, wow, they're translating it all, and they're spreading this knowledge, but it all gets slapped down by this guy, Ghazali. Now, he's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith, and he's the most influential Muslim leader after Mohammed. And he said, stop reading Greek stuff. Because if you read the Greek stuff, you might get pulled away from Islam. And so he said, one should restrain anyone who would immerse himself in these mathematical sciences like geometry. For even though they do not pertain to the domain of religion, yet since they are among the foundations of the philosopher's sciences, the students will be infected by the evil and corruption of the philosophers. So this was a closing of the Islamic world's mind. But at the same time, in Europe, you got a guy named Thomas Aquinas. And he's like, it's okay to read Greek stuff, just eat the hay and spit out the sticks, you know, like a cow. Read the stuff, and every now and then a pagan can get something right, but you can throw out all the rest of the stuff. And so this opened up the European mind, and guess what? They experienced the Renaissance. And so Europe started universities in churches. Bologna, Paris, Naples, Toulouse, Oxford. And now what about the Crusades? And so now we enter the second, called the Turkish phase. And now just a big picture of the world. Close to third of the world is Christian, 31.5%. And then the second biggest religion in the world is Islam, 23.2%, followed by unaffiliated, and then Hindu, 16%, Buddhist, 7%, and then down to 0.2% Jews. And so you have Christians that kill people and Muslims that kill people, and it's sort of a wash, but the comparison becomes a little clear when you compare Jesus and Mohammed. So Jesus never killed anyone, and Mohammed participated in 66 battles and an estimated 3,000 killed. Jesus never led armies. Mohammed led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Mohammed owned slaves. Jesus never married. Mohammed had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. And Jesus never tortured anyone. When Mohammed conquered Khaybar, the chief wouldn't tell where the treasure was hidden, and he had him stretched out on the ground, and they kindled a fire on his chest. Jesus did not lie. And he said, I'm the way, the truth, the life. Mohammed permitted lying in certain circumstances. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit. If you feel threatened, then it's okay to lie. And then Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. One time he multiplied loaves and fishes. The crowds followed him for a free lunch. They wanted to make him king, and he knew that was not God's will. And so he said something difficult on purpose. And many disciples walked with him no more. And he didn't run after him and say, you misunderstood me, come back. No, he turns to the 12 and says, you guys want to go too? There's the door. It's almost like he was intentionally shaking away those following him for the wrong materialistic reasons. But Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. So one, you're forced, the other, you're not. This was a famous imam. He says, if they had got rid of the apostasy punishment, Islam wouldn't exist today. Islam would have ended since the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Opposing apostasy is what kept Islam to this day. Ibn Masud's hadith, kill these three criminals, the adulterer, the murderer, and the apostate that leaves our community. So it's very much like a gang dynamic, right? You join the Bloods and the Crips, fine, but if you want to leave, the gang will kill you. Jesus forgave insults. He's down on the cross saying, Father, forgive him. Mohammed avenged insults. And so when he finally conquers Mecca, he listed 10 people that he had that he wanted killed. And one of them was a guy who made up poems making fun of Muhammad, and then he had 3 slave girls reciting the poems. He was insulted by the poems, and so they got killed. Jesus did not permit the disciples to rape anyone, right? Muhammad did, and there's all these hadiths that talk about that. None of the apostles were governors and generals. Every one of the caliphs was a governor or a general. Jesus taught God was our Father. In Islam, they don't teach that God is your Father. Jesus taught there were children of God. In Islam, Allah took no wife and has no son. He doesn't have children. Jesus taught we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In fundamental Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah. You'll never know him. Even in the next life, you'll never meet him. He's forever unknowable. First 3 centuries of Christianity, there are 10 major persecutions. Christians are thrown to the lions. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, first 3 centuries of Christianity, they have these persecutions. First 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Paris. Jesus said, go to a town, present your message. If they don't receive you, shake the dust and leave. And in Islam, go to a town. If they don't receive you, wage war on the town. And this is a verse in the Old Testament that Jesus quoted. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. There's no concept in Islam of Allah wanting to heal your broken heart. And so when you share with Muslims that God cares about you, he made your heart, he loves you. If you're hurting, you're going through problems, he wants to be there with you, and he wants to rescue you and take you out of that, then the presence of the Holy Spirit will come upon that person, and they feel the love of God. How many of you felt the love of God in your heart, in your life? It changes you. And so then you have Vikings that conquer and go up every river in Europe, and they kill the men, and they throw the women over their shoulders and sail back to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And then they go off raiding some more, and the women have to raise their little Viking kids. But since the husband's not around, they raise them to be Christians. And so 2 or 3 generations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark become Christians. So the Christian Vikings are now called Norsemen, or northern men, but they call them Norsemen. And they conquer Normandy, which is central France. And they invade England, William the Conqueror, William the Norman, right, 1066 AD. But then there's Richard the Norman, and he comes down and he captures Sicily from the Muslim Empire, and then the toe of Italy. And then you have a Reconquista taking place in Spain, and you have 700 years driving the Islamic forces out. El Cid, right, is a Spanish guy who he's fighting and driving them out, and he's wounded, and he knows he's going to die, but one more charge and they'll win, so he has him strap his body to a horse, and they open the gates of the city, and they slap the horse, and he goes riding off, and all the soldiers go riding off, and they win. And they afterwards are going, well, where's El Cid? And he's sort of dead, on his horse. It's a nice romantic chick flick, you can get the movie. And so they're finally driven out, and then the Turks convert to Islam, and there's 2 waves called the Seljuk Turks and the Ottoman Turks, and they invade into the Byzantine Empire. And all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out. Ephesus, Smyrna, Sardis, Thyatira, Pergamum, Laodicea, Philadelphia, and anyway, I always have to concentrate on those. And so as they're invading the Greek Orthodox Christians, which do not like the Western Roman Catholic Christians, over doctrinal differences, they have to humble themselves and beg the West for help. And the West sends help. By the way, the most popular Greek Orthodox saint was St. Nicholas. And when they're coming through, they move his bones over to to Italy for protection, and that introduces all the St. Nicholas gift-giving traditions to Western Europe. And so the Pope that receives the bones of St. Nicholas is named Urban II. He builds a church that's still there in Bari, Italy, and he goes to the Council of Clermont, and he begs these European kings to send help to the Greek Orthodox Christians. Set aside your differences, come to their help. They send help. It's called the First Crusade. And they go to the Byzantine emperor, who expected them to say, here we are, where do you need us? But instead, the Western Crusaders come over and say, okay, we got this. We'll take care of the rest. Well, the Europeans want Jerusalem. Now, any wise military strategy would say, look, let's just take the next town and let's work our way back. It may take us a century to get there. No, they want that prize of Jerusalem, and they get it. But then they have to have supply lines, and after a century, they end up losing it. And by the way, Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade, and he left his brother John in charge of England. And then there you have the Robin Hood stories and everything. And St. Louis, like I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was King Louis IX, and he led the 7th and 8th Crusades. And the Crusades end, and the year 1300, this is the area controlled by the Islamic forces. Then they pick up where they left off, and they invade into Eastern Europe, into Kosovo and Serbia, and there's Tamerlane, and he is an Islamic leader that conquers all of Central Asia. And so in the year 1450, the big Byzantine Empire that was the leftover from the Roman Empire, it shrinks. So all that's left is Constantinople. And so you have Sultan Mehmed II, and he's only in his early 20s, and he attacks Constantinople. And if you look over there on the side, there is a cannon. It's the largest cannon in the world. It was built by a Venetian cannon maker who offered his services to Constantinople, but they couldn't pay him. So he goes to Sultan Mehmed II, and this thing could shoot a cannonball that was 2,000 pounds over a mile. And he's shooting it at the walls of Constantinople, and a Venetian arms merchant comes and says, you're doing it all wrong. You're hitting willy-nilly. You got to hit here, and then the middle, and make a little V triangle, and then the whole section will collapse. And they're like, oh, thanks. So he had the Western military arms producers, right, helping. And anyway, so Sultan Mehmed II conquers Constantinople in 1453. What happens 40 years later? Well, this ends land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China. Remember Marco Polo? Marco Polo went from Venice to India and China, worked for Kublai Khan in the 1200s. So there was trade across the Gobi Desert, the China Silk Road, called the spice route. And but once Constantinople falls in 1453, it cuts off the land trade routes, and that's when Columbus set sail for a sea route. So Columbus would have never set sail over here had Constantinople not fallen over there in 1453. And Columbus thought he made it to India, so he names the inhabitants the Indians. And anyway, as the Turks are invading into the Byzantine Empire and into Greece, the Greek scholars flee west with all their Greek art and architecture and literature, and this is what we call the Renaissance. And then they flee with their Greek New Testaments. So in Europe, they have the Bible in Latin, and only the church leaders knew how to speak Latin. And then when these Greeks are fleeing over there, they say, hey, we can translate the Bible from the original Greek. And that sparks the Reformation. And Martin Luther, and in 1517. In 1529, you have Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He had rebuilt a bunch of Jerusalem. Chris Widener has written about that. It's brilliant. And but he surrounds Vienna, Austria in 1529 with 100,000 soldiers, and freezing rain for weeks, and he calls it off, and so we have a lot of these writers talking about the threat. And then you have the King of Spain captures the King of France. and it's Charles V capturing Francis I. And he surrenders some land, and he gets out of jail, and then Francis I goes over and makes a treaty with Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And now France is upgrading the Ottoman military. And so this is the Ottoman Empire, and the King of Spain. And so we have the two most powerful men on planet Earth, is the King of Spain and Sultan Suleiman. And here's the Ottoman Empire. And they have pirates on the Mediterranean, and the Battle of Malta, September 11th, 1565, and this little island, and they're defeated. And then you have a Battle of Lepanto, biggest battle on the Mediterranean, and you have 230 of the Ottoman ships powered by 15,000 Christian slaves under the deck, and then you have about 200 of the Holy League ships led by Spain, and 25-year-old Don John of Austria, the son of the King of Spain, he is leading the Holy League, and it looks like they're going to lose. And he gets them on deck, they pray, and the wind changes directions. And the Ottoman fleet, you can see the painting, their sails are all without wind, and then the Holy League sails fill up, and they win the battle. But anyway, let's see here. St. Vincent de Paul, you may have heard him. He was captured and made a slave, and then he witnessed to his master, and the master let him escape, and he went back to Europe, and he started hospitals. And then Captain John Smith spent 5 years fighting the Turks in Hungary, and then he goes back and he founds Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia. Captain John Smith. And the Pilgrims, they settled Massachusetts in 1620. In 1625, they save up 800 pounds of beaver skins, put them on a boat, send them back to England for trade, and it gets captured by a Turkish man of war in the English Channel, who takes them to Morocco, sells them into slavery. So in Morocco, you got the Sultan Moulay Ismail, and he had captured 25,000 Europeans. He had like 1,042 kids. He had like dozens of captured wives, and it's like some record of the amount of kids. And but here's what William Bradford wrote, the governor of the Pilgrims: 2 fishing ships with core fish to bring home to England, besides 800 pounds of beaver. Went home, and then she was unhappily taken by a Turkish man of war, carried off to solid Morocco. Captain and crew were made slaves. And then you have 200,000 of these Ottoman soldiers surrounding Vienna, and the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, comes to Vienna's rescue on September 11th, 1683. And he has these 40,000 big hussar horses like Clydesdales, and they... when they win the battle, the soldiers, the Polish soldiers had made wings for their back. Soldiers will put horns on their helmet, and it made this whistling noise, and so the Turkish army drops their weapons and flee, and Jan Sobieski is considered the savior of Western Europe. And here's Teddy Roosevelt: from the hammer, Charles Martel, to the sword of Jan Sobieski, Christianity owed its safety in Europe, effective could well fight as a Mohammedan aggressor. And so here is the tents. And when the soldiers went in the tents, they found these bags of beans, coffee beans, and realized this was this new drink that had. And so the beans came from Ethiopia, which was one African country that stayed Christians, and the Turks called the Ethiopians Kafirs, or infidels, and so they call it the kafir bean, or the coffee bean. And the Polish general George Franz Kloszowski opens the first Vienna coffee house. They weren't sure if they should drink it, so they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. He tasted it and said, "This is too good to leave for the Muslims. Let's baptize it." And then coffee spread across Europe. And they were surrounding Vienna, and they were tunneling under the walls, like sort of a lot of tunnels, right? In Gaza, there's a lot of tunnels. And they were tunneling under the walls of Vienna. The baker was up early and heard the noise. They put buckets out, and they could sort of triangulate where the ripples are in the buckets, and the soldiers were able to dig and intercept the tunnel, and they had filled it full of gunpowder, about to blow it up the wall, and the wall would collapse. They'd come in, and they were diffusing it. So they wanted to thank the baker after the battle, And he said, I don't need any reward. Just give me the sole permission to cook a pastry in the shape of the crescent, and it's called the croissant. And so the next time you have coffee and croissants, you can remember the victory of the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1683. And then there's the Battle of Zenta, where you have 100,000 Muslims invading Serbia, and the Eugene of Savoy, he was like a century before Napoleon, he stopped him. And then you have Napoleon. And Napoleon was a lieutenant, brilliant with artillery, which is cannons on wheels. And since the Ottoman-Franco treaty, they were going to send him over to upgrade the Ottoman army with artillery. And Napoleon says no, and he quits the military. And so the French army says, well, he's a really good guy, let's get him back in. And they send him to Egypt. And so 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt. And the Ottoman Empire was getting a little disorganized at this time, and so he shows up and he says, he goes, I'm sort of like a Muslim. I destroyed Catholic churches, and and they're like, oh, you don't look like, and he brought his archaeologists over, and they discovered the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So when that first wave came in and they were destroying stuff, right, the Coptic language was more or less wiped out. But the Rosetta Stone had these Egyptian hieroglyphics and some intermediary language and then Greek. And they knew what Greek was, and they sort of knew what this other one was, and so they went through all this process of deciphering what the hieroglyphs, and it unlocked the hieroglyphs. And everything we know about Egyptian history is now available because we've able to unlock it. That's and Napoleon brought the printing press to Egypt. They didn't have one before. And things were going good for Napoleon until the British destroy his navy at the Battle of the Nile. And now he's sort of stuck down there, and then he has battles and wars and everything. And he finally leaves his second. He tries to take the Holy Land. He even fights in Accra, and he doesn't win. And so then he goes back, and he leaves his second in command in charge with a little note on his desk. It's your problem now. And he goes back to France, and he puts the crown on his head. Now he's an emperor. And anyway, so now we have the Muslim pirates would capture ships, and the Europeans would pay them tribute to leave their country's ships alone. So England, France, Spain would pay these tributes every year, and America was covered under the British tribute. But when we get independent, they go, you're your own country? You need to pay up your own tribute. So Thomas Jefferson, third president, the day after his inauguration, he gets a demand from the Pasha of Tripoli for $250,000, and Jefferson said no, and he sends in our Marines. So it's called the Barbary Pirate Wars. And here's one of the quotes that Jefferson wrote. The ambassador answered us that the laws of the prophet written in the Quran, that all nations should not acknowledge Islam's authority, were sinners. It was their right and duty to make war wherever they found them, and that to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners. And every Muslim who would be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. And the idea was that they would get 72 virgins up there, so it was a sort of a lustful sexual motivation. We were paying tribute until Jefferson said enough. And Stephen Decatur, Illinois is named after him. He said, Algerians were believed to be masters of duplicity, willing to make agreements and break them when they found convenient. John Quincy Adams, teaches the same thing. And so the Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key. 9 years earlier, he wrote a song to celebrate the Barbary pirate victories to the same tune. And it's in conflict resistance, toil they endured, but the pale beam the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of the nation. The turbaned head bowed to the terrible glare, and form a bright wreath for the brow of the brave. And so it was 9 years later that he rewrote it for the War of 1812, right? And so now we're coming up to the third phase. Is this interesting? I'm sort of a history guy, and I like to write sort of a big swath of history. So the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire lived off the people they conquered. There really wasn't a push to make the conquered people become Muslim. because the Muslims did not pay the taxes. It was the Kafirs, the infidels. They had to ransom their life once a year. It's called the jizya tax. And so as the Christian and Jewish and occupied populations were dwindling, their money was going away. And so it began to collapse. It was nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Greece breaks away in the 1820s, and Albania and Romania and Serbia, and all these countries are breaking away. Libya, they're breaking away. The Ottoman Empire is shrinking. Mark Twain visited the Ottoman Empire in the 1860s, and he says, then we called to the tomb of Mohammed's children at the mausoleum where 5,000 Christians were massacred in Damascus, 1861, by the Turks. They said those narrow streets ran with blood for several days, men, women, children butchered indiscriminately, and so forth. And Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse. Was written in the field about those borders. And anyway, let me see if there's one of the quotes here where he talks about the gates of Jerusalem were like hanging off their hinges, and the story was that if they ever fell, then the Ottoman Empire would fall. And I don't know if I put that quote in there. So I guess not. So, here it is. The Muslims watch the Golden Gate with a jealous eye and an anxious one, for they have an honored tradition that when it falls, Islamism will fall, and with it, the Ottoman Empire. And so, but that's the Golden Gate, and Chris writes about that. So, as the Ottoman Empire is weakened, the Europeans are now taking some of the land. And you have French build the Suez Canal, and then the British take the Suez Canal from the French in 1882. And Egypt is more or less under the influence of the British, and they go down to Khartoum and Sudan, and then the French take Algiers, right? French Algiers, and then you have Italy wanting to get involved in Libya, and then Russia. And so this Ottoman Empire is beginning to weaken. And now, by 1914, it's just this green area. And the British now control the Egypt, and the Russian influence, and the British, and so forth. And you have Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and he has his 13 wives, 3 concubines, and there's a little country called Armenia, and it wants to break away too, and he goes, no more breaking away, and he kills 100,000 Armenians, and a bunch of them come to America, and so here's the Sultan, and you got the British and the French, and they're pulling away parts of it. And now here's a question. Oil. In the 1800s, where did oil come from? Whales. And they would take the blubber from the whales and cook it down, and it was nice, clear oil, and they would put it in these whale oil lamps. And the poor whales were being chased to extinction. I mean, they're chasing them through the Pacific, Moby Dick, Captain Ahab, and they would have gone extinct had not oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, the Drake oil well, and then in Oklahoma, and then in the Middle East. And you had Winston Churchill transfers the British Navy from coal to oil. There's only one oil well in all of Britain, in the Sherwood Forest of all places. And so Britain needs oil. And so they make a treaty with Persia. And it's called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as British Petroleum, or BP. I mean, here's a sign. They're taking down the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company sign, and they're putting up the British Petroleum sign. And but while Britain is now teamed up with Persia, Iran, Germany industrializes. Germany doesn't have any oil wells, and they team up with the Ottoman Empire. Kirkuk, Mosul, and so they build the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, and Iraq is part of the Ottoman Empire. And so Sultan Abdul Hamid II makes a treaty with Kaiser Wilhelm II. And they build like a monument to their German-Ottoman agreement. There's a movie called The Promise with Christian Bale, and it's set in that time period where the Turks were nice to the Armenians and all these different peoples, but the Germans come in and whip them up into a war mode. And so oil is what pulls the Middle East into World War I. If there was no oil, World War I would have been a European thing. Half of World War I was in the Middle East. And they used poison gas. I mean, it was terrible. In Kansas City, Missouri, there is a really nice museum on World War I. And half of it is on the Middle East. And so here's a book, The First World War in the Middle East, Eden to Armageddon, World War I, the Middle East. And now Woodrow Wilson wants to come to the rescue of Armenia. And he wants it to be the first thing the League of Nations will be to recognize Armenia, but we don't want to submit to this League of Nations because it's a one world government thing. And so in Turkey, you have the three pashas. Now the Ottoman Sultan's gone, and these three pashas, they kill a bunch more Armenians between 1915 and 1922. And Teddy Roosevelt tries to get America to come to Armenia's rescue, and we don't. He says, all we're doing is speechifying. We're giving speeches, and nobody's doing anything. And so after World War I, the map of Europe is redrawn, and the map of the Middle East is redrawn. What used to be the Ottoman Empire is now divided up. It's called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and you have France and England and Russia and a bunch of countries, and they're going to take what was the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to divide it up, sort of as protectorates. After the Spanish-American War, America took Puerto Rico as a protectorate and the Philippines as a protectorate. So they were under American control, and we eventually gave the Philippines their freedom, and but Puerto Rico stayed underneath. And I was with somebody from Puerto Rico last week, and they're like, we're glad, we're Americans too. Don't you know that? Because I was talking about, oh yeah, Puerto Rico, we're Americans, we're citizens, And so now, this is where it gets interesting. During World War I, the British were running short on explosives. And so there's a Jewish chemist named Chaim Weizmann. He's from Russia. You know the Fiddler on the Roof? How many have seen that movie or the play? That's what the Tsar is persecuting the Jews. Jews are fleeing. And a bunch of Jews flee to other countries like Britain. And one of them is Chaim Weizmann, and he's a chemist. And he comes up with a bacterial fermentation process to take ethanol to butanol to acetone, which is this they turn breweries into you making this stuff, and the acetone was the needed solvent to make all these explosives. They're so grateful to Chaim Weizmann that after the war, they want to thank him. They want to make him a sir or a knight. And he said, I would really like a homeland for the Jewish people. And so they issue the Balfour Declaration, and they give him the land that the British had taken from the now collapsed Ottoman Empire. And this is what they wrote. His Majesty's government, establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people. Now, it's interesting. Where did the idea of the Jews going back to their land come from? It came from Christians. So in America, we have what's called the Second Great Awakening Revival. Tent meetings and everything. It's this revival. And you had Christians reading in the scriptures about the prophecies in the book of Revelation that Jesus will come back at the end of the world and have a 1,000-year kingdom. And the word for 1,000 is millennial. And so they're what's called millennialists. And this in the early 1800s, you have these millennialists. They're discovering that, hey, did you know, but before the prophecies can be fulfilled, the Jews are supposed to be in the Holy Land. And so you have Christians from the Second Great Awakening Revival going to the Jews saying, you guys need to think about going back over there. And so it was Christians that planted the seed for the Jews to go back. So this is what Jeffrey Alderman wrote, Jewish Chronicle. He says, the Balfour Declaration was born out of religious sentiment. Arthur Balfour was a Christian mystic who believed that the Almighty had chosen him to be an instrument of the divine will, the purpose of which was to restore the Jews to their ancient homeland, perhaps as a precursor to the second coming of the Messiah. The declaration was thus intended to assist in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. This appealed to Lloyd George, believing in the prophecies of a Bible he knew inside and out. Now, this, what I just quoted from, is from the Jewish Chronicle, right? So they're admitting that their idea of going back there came from the Christians. And here's this Zionist movement. There's a hill in Jerusalem called Zion. And so that's where you get this word Zionism. And here's another one, Anita Shapira, Israel, a History. She says, the idea of the Jews returning to their ancient homeland as a step to world redemption seems to have originated among a specific group of evangelical English Protestants that flourished in England in the 1840s. They passed this notion onto Jewish circles. So you have evangelical Christians in America that somehow have this deep down identifying with the Jews. Well, that's because it was the Christians in America that planted the seed for the Jews to go back there. And so this influenced Theodor Herzl. He had the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland, 1897. One of the interesting people that was there was Henry Dunant. He's the first winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he founded the International Red Cross. And it's sort of interesting. He knew that the cross might not be popular in Turkey, and so he started it in Turkey, and he called it the Red Crescent. So if you're in Turkey and you see an ambulance and it says Red Crescent on it, that was started by Henry Dunant, who founded the International Red Cross. And so Lord Balfour addressed a Jewish gathering. My personal hope is that the Jews will make good in Palestine and eventually found a Jewish state. It is up to them now. We have given them their great opportunity. So this is the land of the British Mandate that was given to the Jews. It is the same borders that Moses was given by God. And it goes Syria, down to Arabia, and Egypt, and Iraq, and Mediterranean. Now, somebody messed all that up. His name is Lawrence of Arabia. He's a British lieutenant stationed in Cairo, and he's sent on an assignment to meet with the Arabs, particularly the Sharif of Mecca, and see if the Arabs would be willing to help the British defeat the Turks. But he doesn't just report back, he takes it upon himself to promise the Arabs that they will get all the land in the Middle East if they help the British defeat the Turks. And he knew that he was lying to them. And he writes this. He said in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, had I been an honest advisor to the Arabs, I would have advised them to go home and not risk their lives fighting for such stuff. I risk the fraud of my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East, and better we win and break our word than lose. For being a successful trickster, and to prevent this unpleasantness from rising, I began in my reports to conceal the true stories of things. So he admitted that he lied. Now we have a problem, because the same land is promised to 2 groups. The British with the Balfour Declaration, Chaim Weizmann, right? The British Mandate, and now Lawrence of Arabia. And now the Arab that helped the British was the Sharif of Mecca. He's a Hashemite, and he's called a modernist, and he's moderate. And he's actually a pretty nice guy. And his family, so Mohammed's from the Hashemite clan, and the Sharif of Mecca's from the Hashemite clan, so that his clan was in charge of Mecca from the 10th century on, and had a responsibility for taking care of all the holy places, including Mecca, including the Hajj. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, you go on your Hajj. And so they were coming from different areas of the world, and his goal was everybody get along, and he would also get along with non-Muslims. And so he got along with Lawrence of Arabia, and he got along with helping the British. And so he, even during the Armenian genocide where the Turks were killing those Christians, this is what the Sharif of Mecca wrote. in 1918, talking about the Armenians in the Syrian lands. Protect and take good care of everyone from the Jacobite Armenian community living in your territories and defend them as you would defend yourselves. They are the protected people of the Muslims, right? And so the British said, okay, since you are expecting to be in charge, we're going to take the Sharif's son, Fazl, and we're going to make him king of a brand new country that we've carved out of the old Ottoman Empire called Iraq. So Fazl is the son of the Sharif of Mecca, and he's now the king of Iraq. But he was sort of expecting to be the king of Syria too, because of Lawrence of Arabia's promise. And the movie Lawrence of Arabia, Fazl is played by Alec Guinness. He's a famous actor. You know him because he was also Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. Now, Fazl was nice to the Jews. So here is a picture of King Fazl, king of Iraq, with Chaim Weizmann, the Jewish chemist that was given the Balfour Declaration. Right? They're like getting along. And so this is what Fazl wrote. We feel that the Arabs and Jews are cousins, and having suffered similar oppressions from the hands of powers stronger than themselves, we look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. And then the Sharif himself writes, the resources of the country are still virgin soil and will be developed by the Jewish immigrants, that the country is for its original sons, for all their differences, a sacred and beloved home. So they would have all gotten along. But France decides that it's not just going to be a protectorate of Syria, it's going to come in with its army and drive out Fazl. And France does create Lebanon as a Christian minority enclave. But the French are not really cordial and nice about all this. And when they drive out Fazl, it almost starts another war. And so Fazl's brother is Abdullah. And Abdullah is getting ready to organize his followers to attack France. And so here's the San Remo Conference is the one that gave France the mandate for Syria. And and by the way, somebody that was in Syria that did not like the French was this guy, Amin al-Husseini. And he flees to the British mandate. He flees to Jerusalem, and he eventually becomes the Mufti of Jerusalem. And so Winston Churchill, he quickly steps in. He says, okay, we just got done with the war. We don't want another war. Fazl, Abdullah, Syria, this is controlled by the French, and the British and the French are now friends. So we really don't want to have a war. And so Winston Churchill does a quick one. He takes the land that the British had given the Jews, and he takes 2/3 of it away to create an Arab country called Transjordan or Jordan. And he takes Abdullah, who's the brother of Fazl, who's another son of the Sharif of Mecca, and he makes Abdullah king of Jordan. So you have the modernist, moderate, tolerant Sharif of Mecca, and the one son is king of Iraq, the other son is king of Jordan, and they say nice things about the Jews. And so this is what, so there's Abdullah with Winston Churchill, and there's Abdullah with Winston Churchill, and this is what Abdullah writes in an essay, As the Arabs See the Jews, published in the American Magazine, 1948, before 1948. He says, no people on earth have been less anti-Semitic than the Arabs. The persecution of the Jews has been confined almost entirely to the Christian nations of the West. Right? Because this is right after World War II, and they had the Nazis killing the Jews. But then he also goes back to Spain, and he said, Jews themselves will admit that never since the Great Dispersion. Now, what's the Great Dispersion? It's the acknowledgement that the Jews were there in the Holy Land, and 70 AD, the Romans dispersed them. So this is called the Great Diaspora or the Great Dispersion. And he's referring to it. Never since the Great Dispersion did Jews develop so freely and reach such importance as in Spain when it was under Arab possession. With very minor exceptions, Jews have lived for many centuries in the Middle East in complete peace and friendliness with their Arab neighbors. So you have the Sharif of Mecca, his son Fazl, his other son Abdullah, and they're friends with the Jews. And now Greece wanted to take part of the Ottoman Empire, and Armenia wanted to get free from the Ottoman Empire, and so did the Kurds. The British had promised the Kurds if they would help the British defeat the Turks, they'd get their own land, and they never did. So the British were like making the promises and then coming back and fudging on them. And then the British are letting the Jews go back to the Holy Land, but then in 1922 they issue the White Papers to try to stop the Jews from coming back. And there's a movie called The Exodus with Paul Newman. It was like his first popular movie. Now you have Turkey is about to have the French and these others take it all apart, but Ataturk rallies and he saves Turkey, but he doesn't bring back the Ottoman Empire. He creates the Republic of Turkey, and he is the first president. The word Ata means father, so he's the father of the Turks, and he is a nice guy. He was fighting the Greeks, he was fighting the French, he was fighting the Sultan's army, and he's fighting like 3 different wars all at once. So here's Ataturk with Fazl. And Ataturk is nice. So here's both King Fazl and Ataturk. And notice anything about them? They're dressed in Western clothes. What happened was after the Ottoman Empire fell, it was a blow to the gut of the fundamental Islamic world that their empire's gone. And the West has cannons and airplanes and electricity and all these advancements, and they say the future's the West. It's very similar to after the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. They felt like, not only did their military let them down, their religion let them down, and they were open to Western ideas. And so Japan began to Westernize and so forth. And so here is Ataturk with Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran. And he's in Iran wanting to reform Iran and become more modernized and do what? Tolerate women. And to let the women dress the way they want, and to bring education and give last names, right? Because these different countries would have your name, so-and-so, Ibn means son of, Abu means father of, and they'd say from this different town. But they created, and so, and here's Ataturk with the king of Afghanistan. And guess what? He's bringing all this reform into Afghanistan. Women being able to be free and have freedoms and so forth, and more of a secular leader. And there's Ataturk dressing in the Western clothes. And Ataturk said he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. Even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. He says Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. The purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all nations was to drag them into including Arab national politics. It may have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. And so he changes the weekend from Friday to Saturday to Sunday. He gets rid of the fezzes and the burqas and gets rid of the Arabic language. I mean, he is moving. And here's John F. Kennedy. In 1963, he says, I am honored to join in the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the death of Kemal Ataturk. The name of Ataturk brings to mind the historic accomplishments of one of the great men of this century. His inspired leadership of the Turkish people, his perception, understanding of the modern world, and his boldness as a military leader. It is to the great credit of Ataturk and the Turkish people that a free Turkey grew out of a collapsing empire, and that the new Turkey has proudly proclaimed and maintained its independence ever since. So here you have John F. Kennedy praising Ataturk. And certainly there's no more successful example of national reliance, a birth of Turkish Republic, profound changes initiated by Turkey by Ataturk, deeply interested in friendly relations traditionally existed, Turkey, United States. He noted our democratic government, once said prophetically, we are friends now, and we will be much closer friends in the future. Present alliance traced back, and I'm proud that the United States can be a partner, so forth. And he said, the last line, I salute this great man, anniversary of his death. Here is the Shah of Iran, and he is friends with America, and he's westernizing his country, and